Hello and welcome to Red Red. Today I wanted to talk about Oblivion, a collection of about 8 short stories by David Foster Wallace. This is the last collection of his works, of his fiction work at least, that was published before his death in 2008, and it was really great to get back into the world of David Foster Wallace. Even after having read this and Infinite Jest, I find that personally I still really like Wallace's non-fiction approach, and that's a sort of model that I'm more interested in learning from and emulating. But it was great to read some more of his fiction work, because one of the things that stood out for me, I'll talk about some specific stories in this that I liked and just give general overviews or points, but or give overviews or points about the stories. But one of the things about the whole collection that I really liked is that Infinite Jest, even though we have different characters that will focus on, the two main ones being of course Hal and Don, it still feels like the whole book was written in Wallace's Wallace's voice. And yes, there are sections that are in vernacular and whatnot, but a very distinct David Foster Wallace voice is used for, I think, the composition of Infinite Jest, and it's really appealing. And some stories in this collection, maybe Mr. Squishy, have that same voice, but I felt like as I went on with the stories, I started to see a really great diversity in the way that he approaches writing stories. So there are some stories like Good Old Neon being so completely different in prose style from Oblivion or The Soul Is Not a Smithy. Those three I think were probably my favorite stories, but there are some other really good ones as well. And also what I liked is that, with the exception of the final story, The Suffering Channel, I loved that every single story is written in first person. Sometimes you don't always know that it's written in first person until a little while, and then some other times, like with Oblivion, we have a unreliable narrator. But I loved seeing that, because I actually remember taking notes in Infinite Jest as to which sections were written in first person, and there are really they're quite sparse. There's only about 4 or 5, definitely no more than 5 sections that are written in first person out of the whole book. But yeah, to just talk about all the stories that are listed here, we start with Mr. Squishy, which is it's like, I almost thought about it as a sort of trial by fire to see if you'd be willing to stick through and get to the actual, to get to some of the really good stuff, because the book, that story, Mr. Squishy, is a, descriptive to the absurd degree, like painfully descriptive detail of a kind of focus group that is testing and giving feedback on a type of food called like a chocolate called a felony, and the mascot of that chocolate is Mr. Squishy. And so even though the story is in first person, it basically has this focus group, the man who's in charge of the focus group, and a side being or entity that is suction cup climbing up a building. And I won't spoil how they come together, but a really good story. And sort of it was almost like Wallace was deciding to make an ironic take or an ironic spin on what people said that he did, that he described to an absurd degree, and this story almost felt like him saying, "Oh, you haven't seen anything yet. Let me show you what describing to an absurd degree is." The Soul Is Not a Smithy is probably it's probably up there with Good Old Neon as being like the story for which you buy the whole collection. Even if you're not interested in any of them, just skip and go straight to reading it. The Soul Is Not a Smithy is basically the story of this kid who in like a grade 4 civics class becomes an unwitting hostage to a substitute teacher who is trying to just like write a list of the amendments on the wall, and just starts going fucking crazy and starts writing on the wall in this like unconscious, he just keeps writing, kill them all, and as you read the story and what Wallace talked about, it really becomes a sort of meditation on boredom and the fact that this main character, the narrator who's telling the story, he's an older person now telling the story to, I don't know, like a news article or something, or he's reflecting on when the news article was written at the time, and he's sort of meditating on the fact that this one really profound or interesting or unique experience that happened in his life, he sort of missed out because he was so bored he was daydreaming. So yeah, and then we've got, well, actually I'll come back to Good Old Neon because that's really the standout story, but Oblivion I liked a lot. Oblivion, the story is essentially our narrator Randall is currently in a long argument with his wife Hope, who is accusing him of snoring, and he is just absolutely absurdly convinced that no, I'm not snoring, you're going to sleep and wake and dreaming that I'm snoring, and I know that I'm not snoring because I'm still awake when you wake me up. And it reminded me of Despair by Nabokov, especially with our kind of especially with this sort of unreliable narrator. We've got this pedantic main character. We've got actually, and I feel like Wallace really intentionally chose to change his prose style to really get this sort of to create this florid and slick effect that comes across really well. There's a lot of things that are put in emphatic commas because the main character is sort of being condescending almost to the reader. There are a lot of inserted foreign language phrases that remind you a lot of reading any Nabokov and seeing the French or Russian inserted, and just it's just this sort of petty to the nth degree, but this sort of detail and breakdown. The arguments never happen in the book, in text. There are always the main character's reflection on the argument and his interpretations and him trying to break down what his wife was saying. And it's just this kind of, like, you read it and you're just like, this is so absurd. But as we develop, it gets even more unreliable and so on. Good Old Neon. This is the story of the collection. This is probably maybe the best thing Wallace has written as far as I've read, and it's certainly like the most heartfelt and touching short story that I've ever read and maybe ever will read. But it's this long confession. It almost reads sort of like a suicide letter, where and it's our main character whose name is Neil, and he's just meditating on the fact that he feels like his whole life he's been, well, let me read the first couple of sentences. My whole life I've been a fraud. I'm not exaggerating. Pretty much all I've ever done all the time is try to create a certain impression of me in other people, mostly to be liked or admired. It's a little more complicated than that, maybe, but when you come right down to it, it's to be liked, loved, admired, approved of, applauded, whatever. You get the idea. I did well in school, but deep down the whole thing's motive wasn't to learn or improve myself, but just to do well, to get good grades and make sports teams and perform well, and so on and so on. It's a 40-page story that is a real... It's a story that... you might not cry because it happens slowly, but it will wound you, and the ending is really kind of amazing. And I will actually spoil the ending because I want to brainstorm something about it. And so if you I really implore you, just yeet away from this video and get that collection. Either listen to it online. There are some audiobooks on YouTube that you could check out, or you could find just a PDF of it somewhere. But for those who have stayed because you've read it, you'll remember that one of the lingering questions is, if this guy is dead, if he's killed himself in a car accident, how is he writing what he's doing? And once we get to the end, we find that the narrator was never Neil. It was actually a character named David Wallace meditating on the experiences of meeting a person like Neil in his like high school baseball club in the 80s, and then finding out like 10 years later that he killed himself, and trying to understand what it was like to be that person. And what I thought, I couldn't really, like, I haven't got my hands on any biographies of Wallace, but what I wondered and wanted to know was, does the events of Neil correlate to when Wallace first had depressive episodes and when he was first suicidal? Because I know that was happening right around when he was studying philosophy, but I don't know if Wallace writing this story about Neil, because I looked up and I couldn't find Neil as being a real person, but I was wondering if that was sort of Wallace thinking what would have happened if I actually did kill myself back then. And then we know very tragically that he did kill himself in 2008. But yeah, let me know, for anyone who's more knowledgeable on Wallace's sort of biographic details, let me know if that's a connection that you made, or if that's a connection that's any what valid. But yeah, well, I guess by now I've shooed off anyone who hasn't read the book. So for all of us who have stayed, how great is this, right? But anyway, yeah, those were all my thoughts really on Oblivion. Of course, there are some other stories that I didn't really talk about, like Another Pioneer and The Suffering Channel, that I thought was it was a curious choice for that one to. It kind of stood out as not being a first person narrative, but yeah, that's all I really wanted to say about this collection. I think I'll be rereading not only good old Neon, but the Soul Is Not a Smithy quite a few times, and very glad to have read this. So recently I picked up Zadie Smith's essay collection, Changing My Mind, and in the end of it, I was just looking at the table of contents. She talked about Wallace's brief interviews with hideous men, and I think she did a big piece on that. And I haven't got that collection. I don't know. I've heard mixed things about it. I feel like people have mostly really well regard Oblivion, but let me know if you've read brief interviews with hideous men and if it's worth checking out. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next video.